Hey, everybody. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Show with your hosts, Nancy Reed and Lisa Smith, the mother-daughter travel team on the Love Your Parks tour and publishers of Big Blend Radio and TV magazine, as well as Parks and Travel magazine. You can see them both. Just go to bigblendmagazines.com. Very excited to have Military Mike back on the show today. Military Mike is a military historian, U.S. Army veteran, and award-winning author, and his full name is Mike Guardia. And he's back on the show today to talk about his latest book. It's called TOMCAT FURY, a combat history of the F-14. And I think I've never done a show on a fighter jet, but this is pretty darn cool. Mike is the author of how many books now, Mike? I mean, this is pretty, how many?
Let's see. This one makes 13.
13.
Wow.
I know, because I'm looking at this, and the first time we started talking was like 9 or 10, 8, 9, 10. Now you keep going up and keep going up. So this is the latest one out now. Everyone go to MikeGuardia.com. You'll be able to connect with all his books. Like he's written about Hal Moore, Donald D. Blackburn, so many things. But this F-14, they call it the Tomcat. Like Tomcat, who names these?
Yeah.
That is a very good question, Lisa. You know, every fighter jet and every manufacturer that puts them out, they have their own conventions for how they name it. Some are a little more comical than others. With the case of the F-14, that one was really the flagship product of Grumman Aerospace, which has since been dissolved into other companies. But when Grumman was in its heyday, they were known for naming their fighter jets after felines. For instance, one of the champion fighter planes that the U.S. Navy used during World War II in the Pacific was the F-6F Hellcat. And then there was another Grumman plane that was called the Bearcat, and then there was the Bombcat.
Oh, wow.
And then when jet propulsion comes into its own, Grumman had already made a name for itself by fielding the A-6 Intruder. But when they came online to develop a fighter for the Navy, they said, well, why don't we give this fighter a name in the tradition of what we did in World War II by giving it some kind of name with the suffix cat attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the two men who were responsible for putting the F-14 on the acquisition table and really making it a reality were both Navy admirals whose first name was Thomas. So you had Tom, and then derisively, the Grumman designers and a lot of folks in the Pentagon were calling it Tom's Cat, and the name eventually stuck. Well, hey, Tomcat would be a great name for a fighter jet, and that's ultimately what they did.
Yeah,
because they go in stealth and they come out victory.
Yeah,
that's what Tomcats do. They go in stealth, and they come out victory.
Yeah, I mean we know from
having cats.
But I know, because we travel full time now. But back in the day, somehow we'd always when we lived in 29 Palms, this really happened. People would leave and they'd leave their animals, and we had all the feral cats, and here come the Tomcats.
Oh.
And oh my gosh, they were bolshy, man. They would come in like ears torn and whatever. But I'll tell you what, we never had snakes or anything in that backyard that was bad other than the cats. And they were, there were Tomcats, and they were naughty boys too. They went around the neighborhood.
They walked different than, like, we called them bull cats.
Yeah.
They walked differently than like your normal.
Your normal cats. They just kind of took over the place of that. They just kind of, I don't know. They were the king of the palace over there. When you're in the Tomcat, are they able to talk to each other? Like if pilots are they can go together in unison, right?
Yeah, so for any plane that the U.S. military has, the pilot, co-pilot, or weapons officer, or what have you, they can all talk to each other within the cockpit, and every plane that's in the air can talk to any other plane that's nearby.
That's amazing. So this was right back in the 70s, because I know this came out, in 1974? The F-14 came out at that point. And at that point, this is not walkie-talkies. This was like all kind of piped in that you could talk to each other? Wow.
Yes.
And so when we think about fighter pilots going out there, and then they have these jets, what was the very first jet? Like, because you talked about that jet propulsion and having that changeover, because at one point, I think about Vietnam, you watch movies, right? And that's where I get it and learning from you. you think about helicopters more than jets. And I
Hmm.
remember, the Millionaires Club that started the actual Air Force of, back in World War II. And I might be wrong. It might be World War One. I'm not going to get it right 100%, but started using planes going over. But these were little, yeah, it's World War One, little planes, those little, you know what I mean? Like you see them in air shows now, and you get to take a joyride in them. Like they're not, they're
Yeah,
open.
propeller planes.
Yeah. So we've changed. So when was the first one out, do you think, in regards to
Well,
fighter jet?
we really have to credit Nazi Germany for being the pioneers of what we now know today as jet aircraft. Because in the waning days of World War II, you had the first generation jets that were Messerschmitts that came online, but they arrived too late in the war to really have any impact on tipping the scales of air power over Europe. But of course, after the Nazis lost, we rounded up a lot of Germany's top scientists and brought them over here to the U.S., where they helped us
Wow.
develop our own jets. And more to the point, they helped us develop our own rocket technology.
See, this is amazing. This
Mhm.
is it's interesting.
Yeah.
So
Can you hear me?
yes, Nancy's
Yeah.
Okay.
back out of the tunnel.
I know. I just want to ask about the Red Baron.
The Red Baron. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, the Red
because
Baron.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Red Baron is actually a throwback to World War One. And
Oh,
here you had military aviation really come into its own. I mean, World War One was the first conflict where what we now know today as air warfare came online, because it was
mm,
just barely a decade before that the Wright brothers had put their first airplane into motion.
mm,
And now the militaries of the world, at least the militaries of the first world at that point, realized, hey, I can do some considerable damage to my enemy if I can deliver an attack from the third dimension.
yeah.
And
Mm.
if I'm delivering bombs via the air, well, then maybe there's a market for us to establish air superiority so that another airplane can't shoot down something that we want to deliver bombs.
Mm.
And that
Wow.
eventually gave way. Into the notion of air combat maneuvering, which is more popularly known as dogfighting. And the
Mm-hmm.
Red Baron was one of the first German aces of World War One. Went up against Allied aviators, the old-fashioned biplanes that you were talking about. And he was really the first famous fighter pilot, and his fame really endures today.
Oh man. See,
He was badass as far
yeah.
as well, he was even in cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
You
He's
Hmm.
know,
on.
it was like he became like this superhero on, and just
Now
from
he's on
his
pizza boxes.
expertise of, and then I'm thinking, how many people really know like who the Red Baron is and where he came from and
Mm-hmm.
what he really did? Because now you said World War One, and my mind was it's going to be World War Two. But see, that's how it
See,
goes.
but
Yeah.
World War II was interesting because it came so much faster than everybody thought, right? I think World War One, at the end of it, everybody thought we were fine, and then it wasn't.
Well, the world to end
Hmm.
all, you know,
Yeah,
the
and
world wars to end all world wars, and here we are again.
I really hope we don't have a World War III. But I want to go back to when you were talking about this. It is World War One. The Millionaires Unit is what I was talking about. I had to go look that up real quick and be smart about it. It was the Yale guys that got together and created a private air militia, and that was America's entry into World War One using airplanes or biplanes, right? And that was the U.S. Naval Air Reserve. So it wasn't the Air Force at that time. So this was before the Air Force, right, Mike? Because even with the Tomcat, you're talking about the Navy, and I'm like, wait, because I think Navy, you're in the ocean, and so what are you doing in the
Right.
sky?
Well, I am glad you asked. So, really, to answer that question, you kind of have to lay the groundwork for the difference between Air Force aviation and naval aviation.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, the Air Force, as it exists today, grew out of the old Army Air Corps, which started off as the Army Air Service, and that was establishing air superiority over land. But, as naval warfare became more advanced throughout the course of the 20th century, they said, okay, well, to protect our battleships at sea and to preserve our superiority on the high seas, we need to have air superiority over the high seas, which means we need to have aircraft carriers accompanying our battleships and our cruisers and our troop transports over whatever routes they may take. So let's have a naval aviation arm that provides air superiority and protection to its parent fleet.
Okay. Wow.
And it's actually how the F-14 came to be. When it was in U.S. service, it was exclusively a U.S. Navy fighter, and its sole job was to protect the parent fleet against the threat of any other enemy fighter or any other enemy threat that was out there on the high seas.
Okay, so now I want to ask you, Mike, because you're Army, right? And so I know there's a thing like, don't get it wrong. It's Army versus Navy and all that. So now you're writing the Navy stuff. So how do you feel about writing about something outside of the Army? I have to ask.
Well, the way I see it, I am in, yeah, right. Well, the way I see it, I am an equal opportunity historian. You know, I pretty much write about any topics that I really find fascinating and things that I think deserve to be told and, you know, deserve to be put out to a mass market. My interest in the F-14 is nested under the broader fascination I've always had really with all things military. My first introduction to the airframe itself was watching Top Gun.
Exactly.
And a Hollywood blockbuster that it was, that really put the F-14 at the forefront of American pop culture. It's very easily one of the most recognized planes in the world. And I think pound for pound, it's probably the most popular fighter jet in American history, if for no other reason than it had Top Gun attached to it. And it remains a very well-loved plane by anyone who had any association with it.
Do you think they hired Tom Cruise because it was called the Tomcat? I'm just saying, it's just funny how, you know what, we used to live in San Diego, in Vista, California, just a few doors down from Oceanside. And so we've been to the Top Gun house in Oceanside, California, right outside Camp Pendleton. Hello, that's what I should say. And so it's just funny. And they've done this whole renovation. They're working on it. And they've moved this building around a bit. Last time we were there, it was all protected and getting some renovations. And now, aren't they coming out with a second Tom Cruise thing on this gun? I think they're doing part 2 or something, or I'm just behind the times. But yeah, I mean, you know, and look at him going to Mission Impossible. But Nancy, earlier you had a question for Mike.
Yeah, no, I'm back and forth, but I don't know where we are.
Oh, okay. You don't know where we are? I don't know where we are either.
No,
no, I know. So
I'm only hearing like a quarter of what's.
Oh man, so she's going in and out of tunnels. So can that happen when you're in a fighter jet and you are? That's why I keep going on this communication system. When you have pilots going in, when I was reading in your book, that it can have and you had like what 12 different or 16 targets? How many targets they could track at one time, and then like hit half of them, right? But would you have more than one pilot in their Tomcat at one time? Like how many would be there?
Okay. Well, from a single Tomcat, you could track multiple targets at once. And the target tracking was mostly the role of the man who was in the back seat. He was called the radar intercept officer. For every Tomcat, you had a crew of 2 in the plane. You had the pilot who sat in front. And then in the rear was the radar intercept officer, otherwise known as a RIO. His responsibility was not only navigating the plane, but also being able to track targets, and the RIO could also engage targets from his backseat. And this really increased the situational awareness of the crew, whereas, you know, the pilot could be engaging one target, but if the RIO sees something else come up on the radar, he can engage the target with one of the AIM-56 missiles and guide it via the radar to the other target while the pilot was engaging a completely different plane.
Wow.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so is this like, I remember growing up and hearing dogfight, like the planes were having a dogfight. Is this like the first time where planes actively engaged in like a maneuvers where I'm going to shoot you, no, I'm going to circle around, come back behind you and shoot you? Like a dogfight, like. or no?
Well, dogfights had been going on for almost as long as there had been fighter aircraft. Even in the days of World War One, the Red Baron himself was one of the first expert dogfighters that ever lived. He, according to most records, he scored. It was something to the effect of 80 air-to-air victories, where he was dogfighting other biplanes in the sky.
Wow.
And of course, World War One, the technology being what it was at the time, a dogfight was just two biplanes trying to maneuver against each other to line up a good machine gun shot. But, you fast forward 100 years later, and, the art of dogfighting is remarkably advanced to the point where planes can engage each other from standoff distances via their missiles, and they can shoot and engage targets from beyond visual range. So theoretically, if I'm a pilot and if I have an enemy plane on the radar, I can fire a missile and use the radar to track it all the way to the enemy plane and not even see the plane itself.
Wow.
So this is interesting how this all happens. So when the F-14 comes into play, so it first goes into production in 74, right? That was a good year. It's my birth year, everybody. It's a good year. Good music then too. I'm very young, but then anyway,
makes me younger.
A lot of good things were birthed at that time. Good people too, and then it goes into Vietnam. It went over the seas of South Vietnam, right? So it goes out there, and that's its first time. And was that like a big shock to people when it first happened?
Well, it was something that I think most of the military community had expected, because it was pretty big news in the naval community that F-4 Phantom reaching the end of its service life and that the U.S. Navy had this brand new fighter that was coming online. I think the shock factor really came into play when South Vietnam fell to the communists. What the squadrons aboard the USS Enterprise were counting on was really nothing more than a typical deployment to the Pacific, where you might be diverted to do a humanitarian mission somewhere, or just practice your day cyclic operations of sending up air patrols to have the naval aviators hone their skills. But then all of a sudden, April of 1975 comes around, and now suddenly the two TOMCAT squadrons are being diverted to provide aerial cover and protection to an evacuation that's happening from Saigon. And this was the first time that the civilized world got an up-close look at what the Tomcat can do. It's like, okay, everyone's focused their attention on the situation in South Vietnam. Saigon is about to fall to the communists, and hey, look, there's this new plane that's doing aerial cover missions. Well, oh wow, this must be the new F-14 that everyone's talking about.
It's the Tomcat. It needs its own music, man. It really does. It needs like Mission Impossible music or something, It really does. When you think about coming out, and here's this new, jet, coming out, and a fighter jet, but it's doing evacuations, it's doing all these different things. It is like it's making its debut. And it's interesting when you just look at, here's this machinery, and you think about the designers, they had, at that point, were there ways for them, when you're reading the transcripts, are you reading, is it like a police report when you're reading this? Is this things that you can get in public record, or what? Reading the pilots and even the designers had to be like, I want to see this in action at that point. And were they able to? I'm thinking back then we had TV, but maybe not as, it was all done satellite at that point too, right?
It doesn't read like a police report per se, but there's definitely a lot of hair-raising moments where, the pilot is recounting what happened to him, and you get to feel a sense of uneasiness and a sense of foreboding, in taking this newfangled airplane out over enemy waters. And keep in mind that, even the best of our military equipment has been manufactured by the lowest bidder, so you don't quite know how it's going to hold up.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
That really, it really makes for a good metaphysical element.
I had a friend who worked at JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, and then also at McDonnell Douglas, and he would come back with stories about things that were happening that he wasn't supposed to talk about. So he didn't really, but he kind of always hinted about, now I'm trying to connect the dots here of um, was the plane so sensitive that I'm trying to remember? You said something about I don't know if you call it the steering of the plane, so sensitive that pilots had accidents because they, do you call it a steering wheel? Sorry. Yeah, well, you know what I'm saying is they moved too, like they meant to turn left, but they turned too far left.
It's like going from
I'm just remembering
it's like going
stories
from a
from this
regular
guy.
phone to a smartphone, right?
Yeah, no, but yeah, that it was so sensitive that if you weren't light on the, and
Yeah.
It wasn't really the throttle or even the rudder of the plane. The problems that caused the most accidents in the early days of the Tomcat
yeah,
were a lot of
okay.
engine failures.
Oh,
As a matter of fact, first generation Tomcat, the F-14A, that had a very troublesome engine, Pratt Whitney engine, TF-30, that caused a lot of issues with the plane. It was very underpowered for the airframe, and it was prone to a lot of engine failures. Tragically, the first female fighter pilot was killed on a routine practice carrier landing when the engine of her F-14 failed.
Oh.
oh.
Her name was Kara Hertgren,
Mm.
and she made headlines as the first female fighter pilot in naval history. And it was in late '94 that she was doing carrier landings off the coast of San Diego, and then all of a sudden the left engine of her F-14 gave out, and Kara Hertgren's plane tipped over and tried to eject, but the ejection came too late to where she actually ejected down into the water instead of up into the sky.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
something about that.
That's, and you think about it, there's a risk factor with this. And of course, that's what every military service, I mean, that's why I think, no matter what, you've got to look at everyone getting in a plane, a tank, anybody in the military has a level of risk that they're carrying on their shoulders. And we have to always remember that. And I love our conversations, Mike, because it always brings it back out there. And I love that you're keeping the history of the planes, the people, because it's all connected to people no matter what. One of the things that I found really interesting is the history of it with the Shah. I mean, the Shah. Tell us about that, because that I didn't even expect that to happen. The Shah of Iran, because even now people are going to find that fascinating, because our history's changed around a little bit.
The story of the Iranians getting the F-14. Personally, I find that to be the most fascinating chapter of the F-14's history. Here you had the Shah of Iran, who had been in power for a little over 30 years at this point, the latest in 2,000 years of Persian monarchy. And he decides that, okay, I'm just bringing my country into its own as a secular power. I want to become a major power player, not only on the world stage, also a kingpin of sorts here in the Middle East. So in order for me to do that, I need something of comparable or greater value to what my Arab neighbors have. Now, his chief rival is Saddam Hussein, who lives right next door in Iraq, and Iraq has just signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union. Iraq now has access to all the latest and greatest in Soviet aviation. So, Iran at the time, under the Shah's rule, we had no closer ally in the Middle East than the Shah of Iran. So he comes knocking on Richard Nixon's door and says, I would really appreciate the purchase of any top military equipment that you're willing to give me. And Nixon, wanting to keep those close ties, says, well, you're in luck, because we've done great things with the F-4 Phantom, and we have the Northrop F-5, which is also a good fighter, but how would you like to have top pick of the F-14 and the F-15? Those are two new fighter jets that we're bringing online. And the Shah's pilots test fly both the F-14 Tomcat and the F-15 Eagle. And by and large, the Iranian Air Force falls in love with the F-14. And they make an order for 80 aircraft in total, 79 of which were ultimately delivered. And we have a lot of Americans who live in Iran at this time, and they're there training the Iranian pilots. A lot of Iranians are living over here as well, receiving training at a lot of the military bases. And then the Ayatollah Khomeini comes along. So this, of course, disrupts the longstanding friendship that we had. And oddly enough, a lot of the best F-14 pilots in Iran at this time were imprisoned under the Ayatollah because he said, "Oh, you guys are just a bunch of the Shah's pilots. I don't want you around. I'm going to keep you in prison." Well, ironically enough, their fortunes change when the Iran-Iraq War starts in 1980, where Saddam Hussein invades Iran, and then suddenly, the Ayatollah and the revolutionary government are emptying their prisons, saying, "Okay, guys, we need you. You're restored to flight status immediately. See all those F-14s parked on the tarmac? Go shoot down the Iraqis."
Wow, that's such the middle that the
Yeah,
Middle East is a crazy
crazy.
place. It's crazy. I mean, we spent a lot of years in Africa, and at one point I felt like, okay, I love Africa, but it has its drama. And then I thought, well, let's go see the Middle East. And then I was like, no, I don't.
Yeah, it's all you just get to that point of like it's crazy, but it's interesting to look at it through the perspective of a fighter jet. You know what I mean? It's like it's interesting how you can take, here's
Drama.
this plane and look at what it's gone through. And I look at it. It's really fascinating, to look at it this way because it tells our story, our history, and America's history with the Middle East. I mean, the Shah, because he was a pilot, right? Didn't he get in a plane himself and fly it?
The Shah had been a pilot. Yeah, he was a pilot in his younger years, and that's why he went on record to say, "I want the Iranian Air Force to be the most powerful in the Middle East."
Wow.
So now, okay, so then let's continue on this because it was also used in Operation Desert Storm, right? So this actually
It
even
was.
went against Al Qaeda and everything. This plane did a bunch, or fighter jet. I can't say airplane. This was a fighter jet. This was like, it's an F-14 for a reason. Capital F. It was a
Hmm.
fighter. It went in there. So like you really could just like push buttons and bomb things and do things like right. It's like you think about a video game, someone who's never been in a fighter jet, right? I'm just trying to envision being in it and what it was like flying it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think about, me freaking out on going on high mountain passes and going, now you're on top. You now have to trust the air. And I've flown internationally and everything a lot of times in my life, but I'm thinking about what it was like to be in there. And then like now you're in there, but you're going to have to do something more than just be in the plane. You're navigating, you're attacking, you're being aware. I mean, is it a push of a button really to take out a target?
Well, no, it's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean, even the pilots that I've spoken to, as a matter of fact, I will give one anecdote a pilot gave to me, and it has stuck with me ever since. He said, "If you're ever on a strafing run, and if you ever are trying to engage a ground target, if you don't hit the button, if you don't engage your target, if you delay by even 2 seconds, you'll be
Mm-hmm.
15 miles off of your target."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
Because
there's a lot of, yeah.
You have
yeah,
to be fast. Well, there's an interesting thing. Flight.
about
I mean, you have to engage immediately. You really do. I
Hmm.
mean, because you're moving your target. It's the same in photography. I photograph wildlife, and it's the hardest thing. Photographing people sitting. I don't know. That's not my thing. But there's a thing about if you don't do it in that instant, like you have to go. There's a gut thing, right? At the end of the
Hmm.
day, you can learn all the skills, but isn't it go down to your gut?
It does. It
Hmm.
really does.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Very cool. This is so cool. I mean, just to learn and to keep the history alive of this. So, why did they retire this? I know this was in 2006.
Hmm.
It was also, after 9/11, you think about it all, and then now it says, okay, we're going to retire them. What makes them retire a plane?
Well, it really comes down to dollars and cents. The F-14 was a plane that was comparatively more expensive to maintain than, say, the F-18, which was one of its stablemates. A lot of people within the naval aviation community and within the Pentagon and even on the armed forces committees in the House and the Senate told themselves, well, you have this F-14 that is essentially 1960s technology, and we've been doing what we can to extend the life of the plane, but we think, for better or for worse, that we can get more bang for our buck if we retire the F-14 and make the F-18, which is smaller and cheaper to maintain, if we make the F-18 the standard plane for the U.S. Navy, we think we'll maintain our air superiority and save more money in the long run.
Mm.
Now, this upset quite a few people, understandably, both
Yeah.
in and out of the naval aviation community, because from their perspective, at least, they said, okay, we have a plane that is very versatile. We have an F-14 that can be an air superiority fighter, that can be a ground attack aircraft, that can be a high seas interceptor. It does so much, and it's been doing so well for so long. Why are we going to retire it now? And what's to say we can't keep it under the same dynamic as what the Air Force does with the F-15 and the F-16? They have two air superiority fighters. Why can't we do the same?
See? And so then it doesn't work that way, though, apparently.
No.
Wow. Wow. So now what happens with the F-14s once they get retired? I know in Tucson there's like a museum out there where it's like almost like the boneyards of, planes that you can go to. I'm going to go there now after this. Now I'm like, I feel like a love for this jet plane, or a fighter jet. I feel like, okay, I need to go and see you and say hi. I don't know if it's there, it may be, but is that what happens to them, or do they go to other countries? I mean, does the Shah get more? What happens when they retire them?
Well, I'm glad you asked. There were a few F-14s that when they were retired were put on permanent display. As a matter of fact, there is one particular, in fact, one of the jets that was involved in the second Gulf of Sidra incident in 1989 is currently at the Boneyard down at Mothman Air Force Base. There's also one on display near the airport in Dallas, Texas. But most of the remaining F-14s, believe it or not, were shredded and scrapped. As a matter of fact, when they knew that they were going to retire the F-14, the biggest concern the Department of Defense had was for any of the spare parts to fall into the hands of the Iranians, because Iran still has the F-14 and they still fly it. So they said to themselves, okay, we don't want these F-14s to fall into the hands of Iranian arms dealers and end up on the black market. So we're going to hire a third-party contractor to go around with this big metal shredding machine and turn all of the remaining F-14s into these 2-inch by 2-inch cubes.
No.
Yeah. So the few F-14s that remain on static display, those are the only ones that are still intact. All the others got scrapped.
Oh my God. So basically we need to go back to Tucson, is what you're saying. And we will go visit the F-14 and just, who doesn't want to go meet a Tomcat? Come on.
Exactly.
But that's so sad. That is so sad. That's like shredding family photos. You know what I mean? That's like, that's sad, and I get it. But does that happen with a lot of, tanks or military?
Well, it really depends on what the equipment is and who they're trying to keep it away from.
Wow. Wow. I just, there's something to me, it's like old buildings. I want to keep it, I want to keep it around so we can see it. It's like, railroads, you see places where you see the old caboose and stuff. And I feel like we've got to go in there. We got to remember to have it there is so important. So we know what it was in the past, and you have a respect for the people that came before you that rode in an old caboose from the 40s, you know what I mean? Or before there in the late 1800s. There's some matter of respect. So I'm going to go to the boneyards and go see the F-14. I know Nancy and I will both do that. So that'll be part of our next following in the footsteps of the general story on the Love Your Park store for you. But now we're just doing a detour, right? Detours are okay, right? We can do that. We can do that. That's good.
Sure.
So what's next? I mean, you just keep coming out with more books. So do you have another one that we need to know about?
Indeed, I do.
I knew
it. So what's next in the hopper is, and I may have mentioned this on an earlier episode.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, but next in the hopper is a biography on a gentleman named Paul Gorman.
Give us a little overview of him so that we know.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like we're going to go on another journey with this.
So Paul Gorman, West Point, class of 1950. His introduction to combat is in Korea, where he fights on the Battle of Pork Chop Hill. comes back to teach at West Point, where he is an instructor for a young cadet, H. Norman Schwarzkopf. Then at the start of Vietnam, Paul Gorman, now a lieutenant colonel, is commander of American forces at the Battle of Bong Trang, where he is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for holding off relentless Viet Cong assaults for nearly 48 hours.
Wow.
And he's able to hold off the enemy despite the fact that he is suffering from third-degree burns from napalm.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. And he survives, makes a full recovery of his wounds, comes back to the U.S., and he is the principal architect of the infamous Pentagon Papers.
Oh, that's how I know him. Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I know the name.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm like, I know this
And
name. Yeah.
right, and the story gets even more interesting because after the Pentagon Papers, his final role in the military in the early 1980s is he's commanding U.S. Southern Command, which is responsible for operations that happen in Latin America. He's commanding Southern Command when we had troops in Salvador, when we had troops in Nicaragua, and also when we invaded Grenada.
Well, Nancy and I both appreciate you've opened our eyes. You've taught us so much, and I know our listeners as well. A lot of you know so much more about military history than we do, and we're learning so much. And I think it's great that we can connect on all levels of what we all know, right? It's amazing, and I think you're telling stories. You're keeping history alive by writing the books that you're doing. So we thank you on that. And Nancy would say thank you, but she really did go down the black hole now. We'll get her back somewhere soon, everyone. But really, it's been fascinating. So now, it's like everywhere we go, we're finding so many stories, and it's like, whoa. So maybe, I might have to send you a list of saying, hey, here's a book idea, Mike, because you do them so well. You got to do another one. But Hal Moore, I just want to say I can't wait to do a conversation with you and the good people over at the Hal Moore Museum in Bardstown, Kentucky. I couldn't believe it. We went to Hal Moore's house, and I was texting like, oh my gosh, we're here in Bardstown, and there's a Hal Moore Highway, and what? And next thing you know, we're in the museum and touring around and meeting everybody, and I just reconnecting and being able to have the book. That was a lucky thing that I was able to do. And as we travel, and just being able to reconnect on all, I think it's really important what you're doing and telling the stories of the people, and also the history of the transportation, weaponry, all of that, because it does fall to the wayside. Like you're saying, when it goes to, there's maybe one or two in a boneyard, but the rest get, taken away. I think it's really, really important. So thank you for that. Everyone, again, the book is Tomcat Fury, A Combat History of the F-14. You can get it now. You can go to MikeGuardia.com. I encourage you to go to his website so you can see all the books. Of course, always Amazon, all those great places as well. And you can also see his expert page and also an insider interview on blendradioandtv.com. Go there. And also on loveyourparkstore.com, you'll start seeing more and more of our Mission Possible stories.